Today I want to talk about Temporal Warden and how I beat insane roguelike difficulty with it. In the first part of the video, I'll go over all of Temporal Warden's outrageously good talents, and in the second one, I'll show you the specific character that I beat the game with and talk you through leveling, prodigies, gear, and so on. Temporal Warden is a melee and ranged hybrid weapon class. That by itself is not too rare in the world of fantasy, but in Tome, this archetype is also spiced up with a bit of Chronomancy. The justification for why you can seamlessly swap between both fighting styles is because you literally control time. You can call upon yourself from other dimensions to assist you in combat, have more or less zero cooldown on all of your talents, teleport 20 times per turn, and much more. This is definitely one of the strongest classes in the game, and I recommend it even if you're a new player, because while it's a little confusing to understand, it is basically impossible to build a bad Temporal Warden, and it's extremely fun to play. I managed my first ever victory on this class when I still had no idea about what I'm doing, and I'll link that character in the description if you want to see a comparison to my current character. Before we get to the talents, let's briefly talk about Paradox, the resource powering all of Temporal Warden's abilities. The numbers on your resource bar are your modified Paradox, raw Paradox, and the anomaly chance. As you cast spells, your Paradox will increase by their cost instead of decreasing, and the higher you go above 300, the more powerful your talents get with extra spell power and increased duration. Unfortunately, this also means your anomaly chance starts increasing, giving you a percentage chance to fail using your talent and to instead trigger a random anomaly. These can be a wide variety of things, from giving you a shield, cloning something, or randomly teleporting you. Above 600 Paradox, you will instead start triggering major anomalies, which mostly actively try to kill you, but on Temporal Warden it is pretty difficult to get it that high. Outside of combat, you can then rest and tune your Paradox back to the equilibrium. That should be enough to understand the basics, and I'll talk more about managing Paradox in the build guide. Starting off, there is Blade Threading, and what I want to show you first is that these and every other attack of Temporal Warden are spells. This means they count for talents like Time Dilation, but because the usage speed is still weapon, they get affected by attack speed and physical critical strike chance. This also means all of Temporal Warden's debuffs are applied through spell power, which you will very likely not have enough of late game, but with high Paradox as you fight and the fact your talents have very short cooldowns, sooner or later one of the debuffs will stick. My character ended up with 67 spell power, where I usually aim for a 100 plus if I need the debuffs to land, but on Temporal Warden you just don't rely on them. In short, if you just want to click buttons and not think about this too much, I can confirm it works perfectly well. Warp Blade looks like the usual weapon stun talent, but this one can also pin, blind or confuse instead, which seems like a downside at first because stun is the best of those debuffs, but the cooldown of this talent is in reality more like 2 turns, not 6. Yes, it can get this extreme, so the fact that you can apply different debuffs is almost an advantage. This talent also introduces the rule change that swapping weapons on Temporal Warden is an instant action, but it's only for the sake of using talents. If you swap your weapons with your hotkey, it will still take a turn. Blink Blade is your gap closer talent, possibly going all the way to 10 range, but there is a slight downside to it. Unless the target is alone, the second strike takes you to another random target in range, which can get you in some tough situations. Fortunately, one of the locked trees has a talent that makes all your random effects hit a specific target, so you can completely avoid this downside. Temporal Warden also has powerful synergies with teleporting on top of the already existing out of phase stat on gear, so this is pretty much a perfect talent. Blade Shear is the AoE that also has an execute of low health enemies tied to it, and this doesn't work on enemies that have insta-kill immunity, but the vast majority of enemies don't. Even uniques or random bosses frequently don't have it. The one weird part of this talent is that when you click it, you first target the cone, and if there are adjacent enemies to you that are not in the cone, they will not get melee attacked, which feels wrong. The text reads as if your melee attacks target any adjacent enemies, but once you know this is how it works, this is rarely a problem, so this talent is also pretty good. Blade Ward is the parry talent, you know, like the rogue classes have, where it reduces a bit of damage from melee attacks like armor, only this time it just reduces all of the damage. In fact, the way this works, you don't even get hit, so if it's a stunning blow coming at you, you take 0 damage and you don't get stunned. These kinds of passives are always good in Tome, and this is no exception. This only works if you have your melee weapons out, but then if you are getting hit in melee, you are probably using the melee attacks, so you don't really even have to think about it, it just kind of happens naturally. So it's looking good on the melee front. What about bow threading? Arrow stitching fires 3 arrows on a target, 1 from you and 2 from you from different timelines, although those only deal 50% damage. This might not seem that impressive at first glance, but all the Temporal Wardens from different timelines share your gear, so if you have 30% on hit to slow global speed, you'll get 3 chances to apply it with this talent. And Temporal Warden even has some inbuilt on hit effects, so I like this talent a lot. Singularity Arrow is the ranged AoE, but it also works okay on single targets as a harder hitting basic attack. It's also the ideal talent to pull enemies from around the corner. Arrow Echoes fires an arrow on the target from your original location for the next 4 turns, and it updates the position of the enemy, so it won't just keep firing on the tile, it specifically targets the enemy. Delayed damage is worse than upfront damage, so this only really becomes a good talent after the 3rd turn, but it's effective against the tougher enemies, and it again has some synergy with on-hit, so it's alright. Arrow Threading makes your arrows passively tune your paradox to your chosen value on hit. This is something I skipped over, as it's not super important, but you can choose your base paradox value, it doesn't have to be 300, and this talent is pretty good. You want at least 2 points here, since you bizarrely get a lot more value for the 2nd point. So this is the baseline for Temporal Warden. 2 solid talent trees with decent attacks, but now it's time for the really overpowered stuff. In Temporal Combat there is Weapon Folding, which just adds a flat temporal damage to your attacks and even makes you act a little faster. It's okay. What I really appreciate about this talent is the description, which says you fold a dimension of your weapons upon itself, which I'm not sure what that exactly means, but it sounds cool, and Temporal Warden's talent descriptions are full of flavor like that, and I think it definitely adds to how playing the class feels. Invigorate makes all your talents cool down twice as fast. This is crazy. It works on Inscriptions also, and it lasts long enough so that you can comfortably use this before a fight. Of course, on top of that, it also gives a considerable health regeneration, so this should just be maxed on any Temporal Warden. Weapon Manifold passively gives you some on-hit effects. They have an 8-turn cooldown, but they cooldown faster as they proc, so this is up very often. The resistance reduction is super powerful, it's just like a damage multiplier, and the other 2 also apply strong debuffs, so I like this a lot. What's interesting is that I am fairly sure that the Wardens that you summon from different timelines don't share this cooldown, so they can also proc their own weapon manifolds. Breach is a hybrid attack that reduces immunities, which is good in theory, and it also reduces armor hardiness, which is good against classes like Bulwark, and in reality I think I used this talent like twice maybe. There's just always something better to use. And now for one of the best talent trees in the game, Temporal Guardian. Strength of Purpose is your weapon mastery for all of your weapons at the same time, and it makes you use magic instead of strength. This is great because it makes you not have to awkwardly stretch out your stats. Guardian Unity makes you invincible, or at least that's how it feels every time it procs. It not only massively reduces damage you take, the clone can also attack for a little while and blocks enemy talents. I like maxing this as soon as I can. Vigilance lets you passively spot enemies through stealth, a pretty normal filler talent that's on a bunch of classes, but this one has a little something extra, an up to 30% chance to just remove a debuff from you every turn. So you are not dying from damage because of Guardian Unity, and while Vigilance does not save you from getting overwhelmed with debuffs by itself, it's still really good. To top this off, there is Warden's Call, which is a mediocre hybrid attack with a not so mediocre effect. It gives up to 30% crit chance against the chosen target, and makes random targeting always focus on it. The less damage taken from lower ranks is not as good as it seems. It's very rare you get much use out of it, but who cares? If a talent has 50 effects, they don't all need to be amazing. It also lasts for 10 turns for some reason. It feels like the usual class would have it last like 5 turns at most, maybe, but Temporal Warden clearly follows its own rules. Spacetime Folding is the one outlier tree. It does not really fit with the class and it's more of a Paradox Mage thing. It's about manipulating enemies by teleporting them, and you need a lot of spell power to do this reliably. There are some incredibly creative builds out there on the forums utilizing this, but the vast majority of Temporal Wardens can safely ignore this. Speed control has celerity, which sucks less than I said in the Paradox Mage video, and that's because it works while moving on the overworld map, which makes it a little easier to avoid patrols. In the actual dungeons though, it is still pretty much useless. Time dilation passively gives you speed for the high price of using your talents. This should be maxed. Haste gives you even more speed at instant speed, and this should also be maxed because acting more often is pretty good. And time stop I mostly consider a sort of supportive escape talent. For example, if you use this before a movement infusion, you can completely safely run away. But the problem is it costs Paradox, so it could instead trigger an anomaly, which would skip your turn, so you probably don't want to use this if you're going to die if that happens. So it's not bad, but I just never felt like I need it on Temporal Warden, and I would rather spend the points elsewhere. In the lock trees there is Threaded Combat, the final piece of the hybrid melee ranged playstyle. Threadwalk is either a bow attack that teleports you into melee, or a melee attack that teleports you to the range of your bow, so eventually 10 range away. This is extremely useful, not only for gap closing or creating a gap, but you can also just use this as an escape, because if you hold control, you can fire at any tile without targeting an enemy. On top of this, Threadwalk also gives you a bit of out of phase, so you don't need as much of it on your gear. And if you are not satisfied with halving all your cooldowns through Invigorate, Blended Threads is here to reduce them even quicker, as it takes a turn away each time you hit with your weapons. This has a cap, and it's not hard to hit multiple times per turn on Temporal Warden, especially if you go melee, since you hit twice while dual wielding. So you invest here depending on your playstyle. Thread the Needle is either a radius 1 melee AoE or a bow beam, which is what's more useful 99% of the time, and it can easily clear out entire rooms, especially once you have some on-hit effects like the Weapon Manifold. Warden's Call is a passive that makes a Warden from a different timeline appear once per turn when you attack, hitting with their melee weapons if you shoot a bow, or shooting their bow if you hit with melee weapons. Okay, it's only a 50% chance, but with the speed of Temporal Warden, it will be pretty much happening every single turn. This is very good, as it's just a lot more damage, but on top of that, as the summoned Warden is you, with your items, it opens up really fun possibilities for your gear. For example, I had the Blade of Distorted Time in my second weapon set, which slows enemies down on hit by an insane percentage that I didn't even think is possible, and with Warden's Call, I didn't even need to get my own hands dirty. I could just fire my bow at maximum range, and this debuff would continuously get applied to enemies because the summoned Wardens are hitting it with my melee weapons, constantly applying that debuff. This talent is also the main cause for a common phenomenon on Temporal Warden, where you realize you don't even know what's happening. There are like 5 arrows flying through the air, explosions everywhere, and everything just dies. Then there is another odd tree for Temporal Warden, Temporal Hounds, which turns you into a sort of summoner. They are most similar to shadows from Doomed, not requiring a lot of micromanagement and just automatically appearing over time, and they can get incredibly high stats because it's based on your magic. You can teach them to teleport and target a specific enemy, even giving them a bunch of all resist in the process, and in case that's not enough, they can also become invincible for 3 turns when taking lethal damage. This makes them extremely annoying to deal with and excellent meat shields. And for the final talent, you get kind of a Vermig breath from each of the Hounds, doing solid temporal damage and lowering all stats. I have very limited experience with this tree, as it's not really something I want to be doing on Temporal Warden, so if you are interested in focusing more on the dogs, there is a fairly recent forum post by BoboJoe4343 that goes into how to make them work, and it's linked in the description. Finally, there is Stasis, but with only 1.0 mastery. Spacetime stability fixes your paradox a little bit every turn, and it's just strictly worse than arrow threading. Time shield is why this talent tree is always good. It's an instant speed shield that also gives you health regeneration after it goes away. It makes getting through the early game a lot easier. Stop is an AoE stun, and while it's a very good talent, it is best left for Paradox Mage, since you'll struggle to have high enough spell power to apply it, and it deals temporal damage, not physical, which is what you're likely going to focus on. And Static History makes you not trigger minor anomalies for a bit, which is again more of a Paradox Mage problem, since Temporal Warden doesn't want to be at high Paradox really, so I didn't really find this talent too useful. On the generic side there is Chronomancy. Precognition is magical track, letting you see enemies through walls, and doubling bonuses from Foresight when it's active, and Foresight passively gives some defense and crit shrug off, which reduces enemy critical multiplier, so it's pretty valuable. And then with a few extra points in Precognition, you can use it to pre-buff yourself and double these bonuses. Contingency is a sustain that lets you pick a spell and instantly cast it when you get below a certain health threshold. Usually this should be your best shield, and you can even use runes for this. It's kind of like Cauterize, but only costs you a single class point. And See the Threats is, and this might be controversial, a good talent. It takes a turn to cast, and then splits reality into 3 timelines, which you can explore for a number of turns. After that you pick which one you want to continue playing, and that's it really. And it can only be cast once per zone. Still, I think it's very good, because it only requires a point, and in niche situations it's just very useful. You can use it to try and save an escort that is trying to kill itself, or to explore different paths to see which one is the best to run away into, or to fight enemies to see in which of the realities you crit more often, or in which one you resist the stun with only 44% stun immunity. Keep in mind it does take a turn, so it's not the best idea to try and cast it when you are about to die, and if you do die in any of the 3 new timelines, you get kicked out at the point at which you originally cast See the Threats, so try not to die. You can always cancel a reality early if you are in danger. In Spacetime Weaving there is Dimensional Step and Instant Speed 10 range teleport. This is the best escape talent in the game, and it's not particularly close. You can just snap your fingers at any time and get out of any situation. Combined with a movement infusion, this makes you feel really safe. And with Invigorate, this also only has 5 turns of cooldown. Dimensional Shift is the second part of why Temporal Warden's defenses are so incredibly good, as this just makes you pretty close to being immune to debuffs. You can realistically teleport almost every other turn, then 1 in 3 turns a debuff is removed through Vigilance, and you should still be immune to stuns and confusions through gear, and still have a few inscriptions just in case, and at that point debuffs just stop being a problem. Wormhole is a very niche talent, allowing infinite teleportation for a time to remove all your debuffs, or you can use it to try and keep an enemy away from you, but the problem is with low investment, it doesn't have the best accuracy, so it's pretty dangerous to use for yourself. It would be worth more points if Temporal Warden didn't have 5 other ways to teleport, but it does. And Face Pulse is a later game sustain once your character is fully functioning that will debuff enemies around you each time you teleport, which you do a lot. Sure, you might only have like a 40% chance to apply the debuffs because of low spell power, but honestly, that's good enough for me. There's not much else to put your points into anyways. In the locked categories there is Survival, where the best talent is Track, which you do not need since you have Precognition, so this shouldn't ever be unlocked. And then there is Fate Weaving at only 1.0 mastery. Spin Fate passively gives you a bit of defense as you get hit, and it stacks up to 3 times. It's alright at 3 points, but it's optional. Seal Fate gives you spins when you deal damage and lets you prolong debuffs on enemies. The impact of this is negligible on Temporal Warden, as fights are over very quickly, but you can just turn this on to stack the spin fate stacks quicker. Fate Weaver also passively gives you power for your spins, and it's again optionally okay for 3 points. And then the reason why you go here, Webs of Fate, which makes you significantly tankier for 5 turns and lets you get twice as much spins. 27% might not seem like that much to you, but it just makes sure you never get damage spiked too hard, and you should have Invigorate running in the background, healing you back up, so it is that much and you should max this. So here's my guy, straight from the final boss. As always, these are the Addons that I use, none of them affect gameplay, they're mostly for UI, and even though you can definitely play on vanilla, especially if you're a new player, this one, Plenum Tooltip Custom Edit, is actually very useful on this character. What this allows you to do, I mean, it does a bunch of things. It basically changes this tooltip on the right when you hover over an enemy. And on Temporal Warden, since you have Blade Shear that checks insta-kill immunity, what you will have to do when you want to know if you can insta-kill an enemy, you'll have to hover over them, right-click, inspect creature, go to defense, and then look through their resistances to see if they are immune to insta-kill. This is pretty tedious to do this very often, so instead, with this add-on, you can press Shift, and then you will see the immunities right there below the resistances, and this is just way quicker and just way more comfortable. And then it even does a bunch of other stuff, but basically all I use it for is to just check the immunities by pressing Shift. I think that alone is worth using this add-on for. I've again uploaded my playthrough without commentary through High Peak and the final boss. It is by far, I think, the fastest I've ever gone through High Peak, and especially the final boss is just a speedrun. I think it takes like a minute and a half or 2 minutes to kill both of them. So it's linked in the description if you want to see that. And now we can dig deeper into the character itself. For stats, it is pretty simple for the first two. You want to max magic first, because that upgrades all of your weapon damage. Second, you want to take dexterity, as it scales your arrows, and also your offhand, if it's a dagger, that also scales with dexterity. And for my third stat, I originally went into cunning, and I thought I would max it, and then put some points into willpower, so that I reduce my paradox a little bit. But then I realized that the points in cunning are just kind of wasted, because of Warden's focus that just gives you 28 or 30% of critical strike chance for free, since you want to apply this anyways to counteract the random effects. So I think you should definitely max willpower third, as it just makes managing your paradox a lot easier. And then, honestly, maybe you could even skip cunning entirely and put it into constitution or strength. This really depends on what gear you find, what position your character is in, but right now I have 91% base critical strike chance, so for example on my bow I already have 107 before applying my Warden's focus, and on my melee weapons I also just have an excess of critical strike chance, so I don't really need any of these points in cunning. I originally thought I wouldn't even put points into willpower because you already have tools like arrow threading to reduce your paradox, but I think it's ultimately definitely worth it. It's just really nice to not trigger random anomalies, to not have the game skip your turns, and what it allows you to do is turn up your base preferred paradox level above 300. So right now I have it set to 390, so I am getting bonuses for this number. So if you check on Spacetime Tuning, you can always see the effects of your preferred paradox. So my base spell power is 70 right now, but since my preferred paradox is 390, for all my Chronomancy spells, which is all my talents that I have, my spell power is actually 80. And as I use my talents, this increases. It's 84 now, because it's 430. What's more useful than the spell power is the duration, and I decided on 390, which is just an arbitrary value, but I decided on it because a lot of my fights I would start with Time Shield into Haste, and right now Hastes last for 6 turns, but if I do Time Shield and then I do Haste, then it lasts for 7 turns. It hits the threshold of increased duration where it gives me an extra turn, So that's why I decided on 390. If you are confused why I have 0% anomaly chance, even though this number is above 300, it's because the anomaly chance is based on the first number, the modified paradox, which is below 300, so I'm not getting any anomalies. If I would spam some of my talents, you can see that as soon as it gets above 300, you will start getting the anomaly chance. I know it can be a little confusing, like it took me a while to wrap my head around how it exactly works, but the tooltips I think are pretty good. So if you are confused, usually if you just look at the Spacetime tuning talent for long enough, you should be able to understand it eventually. Or if you have any questions, feel free to ask. For my race, I decided to go for Cornac, purely for the reason that I really wanted Time Shield, just because I really love instant speed shields. It's basically like having 6 inscriptions, but other than that, Cornac is not really important for this build at all. You could pick any of the other races and skip Stasis. In fact, it might even be better, because I didn't really have anywhere to put a lot of my generic points. For example, I don't need 5 points in the combat accuracy, I don't need maxed out precognition, I don't need 4 points in Seal Fate, so if I was, let's say, Shalor, I could invest into the Shalor talents. So feel free to pick any race that you like. For the leveling template, this time you really should look at it more as a rough guideline, other than a precise follow this exactly order of talents, because it is extremely defensively tailored, especially in the order that I take the trees, where I start with Stasis, then I take an Inscription, and then I go into Fate Weaving over Threaded Combat. Feel free to take Threaded Combat first. It unlocks a lot of your damage, it unlocks a lot of the fun earlier. My reasoning for building so overly defensively is that I'm playing roguelike, right? I can't afford to die. And honestly, I never once felt like I didn't have enough damage. Like, if there was ever a character where you should try and experiment, you know, if you feel like, this seems like a much better choice than, what I said, why is this worse? This is the character to just try it out and test it out for yourself, because you have an extremely powerful foundation to rely on. For the Prodigies, I played it very safe. I took Ethereal form on level 25. This is basically Cauterize, but just 100 times better, because it stops you from getting one-shot, and it gives you all these other great stats. You can see it gives me 95 defense, so my character has 104 defense just by standing still, and then I get more defense as I fight through Spin Fate stacks. And then for the second Prodigy, Arcane Might is just an absolute no-brainer, since you are stacking magic as high as possible. Even from Escorts you are taking magic because it scales a bunch of your talents and your weapon damage. So I think these are the clear 2 best Prodigies. And then for the gameplay, you basically play this class like an archer. You always start by using your range talents, and for as long as you can, you just shoot arrows. If the enemy closes the gap, or if you get debuffed, that's usually when you switch to melee weapons, because one of your best teleports, or most expendable teleports, is Blink Blade. So if I'm shooting my arrows and I get stunned or confused, I will Blink Blade in, Warblade Blade Shear, and then you can Thread Walk and teleport back to 10 range away from the enemy and continue firing your arrows. You are also tanky enough that you don't need to use all of your defensive cooldowns at once. So before the fight I would try and use Precognition, since this gives me 52 more defense and 12% chance to ignore critical hits because of 5 points in Foresight. And then I also always Invigorate before the fight, since it ends up lasting like 8-9 turns. So even though a little bit of it is wasted, I found it's always better to use it before the fight than to spend a turn on it during the fight. And then I would usually go for like a Time Shield and then the Psionic Shield. Then you pop the speed buff and then you go fight. And once the Psionic Shield comes down, I still have Webs of Fate and like this Rune Reflection Shield to make me insanely tanky for like 15-16 turns. And once this comes down, I will have my Time Shield back up, because obviously it cools down 2 turns per 1 turn because of Invigorate. So you're just really hard to kill. For the Inscriptions, I still run a movement infusion, because while Dimensional Step is absolutely incredible, and most of the time it is enough to escape, these two, they don't clash with each other, they make each other better. It just means that in the few situations where the movement infusion would not entirely save you, if you combine Dimensional Step and movement infusion, then you will escape every time. Now what you just seen here is one of the rare dangers for Temporal Warden, and that is zones when you cannot teleport. These will usually be like around vaults, you cannot teleport like in and out, and while you can see that on the bottom right, it says cannot teleport to this place, it is easy to forget about this and then, rely on your Dimensional Step working, which makes sense. When you press it, it will just fizzle, and it's a bad time. So around vaults, you want to try and be careful, because sometimes you will feel like your teleport should go through, but it doesn't go through. It's just a little weird, so that's something to keep in mind. The rest of my inscriptions are the usual: Rune of Dissipation, a Wild that can cleanse mental effects, so that I can get rid of silences. Although Temporal Warden doesn't really get crippled by silences as much. I mean, it still sucks, you won't be able to use any of your talents, but you can still use your auto attacks, which are very powerful. So in theory you could probably get away with not running a specific inscription just to cleanse silence. Then a godlike Shatter Afflictions that not only has the lowest cooldown possible, but shields me for 180 per debuff, and Rune Reflection Shield, which I like taking usually when I'm on a character where I max out magic really high. It is one of the biggest shields, and it deals damage back at the same time. This is also good because you can run it in your contingency, which I don't think this has triggered a single time in my playthrough, but it's there if I ever needed it. Also looks pretty cool. So gear is pretty interesting on this class because you will have both a ranged weapon and melee weapons. In terms of damage, you are primarily focusing on physical. That is where most of it will be coming from. You do deal some temporal, so if you find temporal, that's a nice bonus, but definitely focus on physical first. The nice part about this is that some of the mods, for example on the ropes, the mods that give you physical damage also give you temporal damage, so you get both in one. And I guess we can start from this side, since I talked about it. Yet again, my rope is by far my best offensive item, giving me 60% increased physical damage and a bunch of damage penetration. And usually you want to get a lot of your resistances on your rope, but because of out of phase, which I guess I can't trigger it now because I can't teleport in this zone. This is how my resistances look like by default, and if I ever teleport, which I usually do pretty early, if the enemies are scary, I basically cap all of my resistances, plus the absolute resistance from Ethereal form, so you can definitely afford to skip some of the really good resistance modifiers on ropes. So the rest, you just try to find critical multiplier, immunities, then increased damage, damage penetration, and increases to magic and willpower are both very useful. This helmet here is fairly weak. I think I ultimately kept this one because it gave me +2 light, and I just couldn't fit that in anywhere else. On the amulet you can get this mod that increases your resistance cap, which is very nice since you can easily get that many resistances through the out of phase buff. Your cloak is the most reliable way to get the out of phase buff, which is the defense/teleport, resistances/teleport, duration/teleport, which comes from off the Voidwalker modifier. On most of the other item slots, to get this modifier, you need to get lucky. It needs to roll as the random modifier. My gloves are Daktun's gauntlets because of the massive critical multiplier. My belt is Girdle of Preservation just because it's just always good, and all my belts sucked, so this was an easy option. My boots give me 7 different immunities, which might be a record. For the most part, you are looking at the Undeterred mod that gives you Silence, Confusion, Stun immunity, a Psionic Shield, which is the best tool, a Lantern that has a higher crit multiplier than Daktun's gauntlets, and it even gives me 20 willpower, which is a pretty big difference. If you look right now, I have 194. Without the Lantern, I guess I need to change this maybe for it to update. Yeah, jumps to 234. So don't underestimate willpower, it just feels nice to have, and the more of it you have, the higher you can push your base paradox, which gives you buffs, so you can never have enough willpower. my rings just take care of the resistances, and I went a little overkill on the stun resistance. I have 217 stun immunity, just a little over the top. And then the interesting part, the weapons. So for your bow, by far the most important stat is the range. Nothing else matters because the range affects all of your range talents also, so you're getting extra attacks. After range, bows don't really have all that interesting modifiers because all of the good stuff is on the ammo. This actually dictates your damage. So by far the best one that I ever found was this Sauron 3 longbow. That gives me 20 willpower, 10 dex, very nice stats, some crit and increased damage and resistance penetration. About as good of a bow as you can find. And then on the ammo there are many modifiers, most of them good. Unfortunately this is only a purple item, but here you are just looking for the highest damage value and a decent capacity. 23 arrows is more than enough, but if you get to quivers that have like 12 arrows, that's a little more annoying to play with. And then for the melee weapons, if you can find Blade of Distorted Time, then this must be best in slot. I forgot this item existed, and when it dropped I first thought that this has to be bugged, because this gives you a guaranteed slow of 176%, or somewhere around there, since you will be pumping your magic a lot. Now unfortunately this does not mean that the enemy just doesn't get to ever play the game, but it does mean that if they have 100 global speed, once you attack them, they will get it reduced to below 50%, and this combined with your speed of haste and then casting your other effects that increase your speed through time dilation means that it's not very fair. The enemies basically don't get to play the game while you are just dancing all around them, firing 50 arrows. It's pretty disgusting. And as I mentioned in the talent overview, you don't even need to go into melee. You can just stay maximum range and fire arrows, and the Wardens from Warden's Call will use melee weapons, which means your melee weapons, so they will continuously apply this huge slow to just everything, because this is not single target, this is radius 6, so even though this is not the highest damage weapon you can find, the absolutely insane utility it provides is more than worth it. And then on your offhand, you'll probably want a dagger, and there are a lot of good modifiers, like for example this one that gives you on hit, stun, blind, pin, confuse or silence, and I think it's worth valuing that more than more increased damage. Like I found daggers that dealt like 180% power, but since I for the most part try to stay at range and use my bow, I just needed these to apply as many debuffs as possible. For the elixirs, you want class points first, then generic points, then increased magic and willpower, and then I guess in a perfect world you would get the elixir of invulnerability. For the escorts, magic is the most desirable stat, since it scales both of your weapons. You're taking arcane might, and it even scales some talents like foresight, so I got pretty lucky and I have magic basically everywhere. I took here one misdirection, which helps with physical debuffs, and then it's magic, 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 and more magic. In conclusion, Temporal Warden is one of the best melee classes in the game and one of the best ranged weapon classes in the game, combined with the Chronomancer's defenses, which unsurprisingly makes for a disgustingly powerful class, very well rounded with no big weaknesses, and it might be just my favorite class design in Tales of Maj'Eyal. I think it's one of those classes where you read through the talents and it sounds really cool, and then you play it and it feels even better. I also want to mention that the focus on this channel is the games. That's my passion, that's what I want to talk about. It's not really about me, but I wasn't really sure how making a video is going to go, but I've been really surprised by just how nice and kind and positive basically everyone that I've interacted with is, and it makes me really enjoy working on these videos in my free time. So I wanted to make it known that I appreciate that, and thank you. Some of the highlights are when people comment that my videos help them get into the game and discover how awesome and fun it is, and that's just so cool to me, that puts a smile on my face. So yeah, see you next time, and thanks for watching.